In this section, we are covering how we actually go about measuring structural violence, this large outside of the general news cycle phenomenon. How do we know it's happening? How do we know how often it happens? So Galtang and Holovec proposed a method for measuring structural violence by using the difference in life expectancies. Kohler and Alcock, using this concept, contrasted the differences in life expectancy between the country with the highest life expectancy. At the time, it was Sweden in 1965, and then other countries in the world. They contrasted the measure with what they referred to as the egalitarian model, which is based on what life expectancy would be if global wealth was distributed equally across all the people of the world. So this just isn't the wealth within a country or a province or a state. This is if the global wealth was completely socialized, everybody had the same amount. The estimate of life expectancy for the idealized condition with equal distributions of income and resources would be 68.3 years. And remember, this was in 1965. Compared to Sweden, which was 74.7. So the estimated egalitarian model provided a systematically more conservative estimate when we look at life expectancy. So there's not the comeback of, okay, well, Sweden had this, it's considerably larger. So for data collection and statistics, this egalitarian model proved to be a better way of looking at it. And based on the analysis, structural violence was estimated to be at least twice the magnitude of what the authors referred to as behavioral violence from war and crime and civil unrest. In regards to mortality and morbidity differences, in all societies, those in dominated positions, especially as defined in terms of class and ethnicity, they experience higher rates of morbidity and mortality than those who are in the dominant positions. And this is what we've talked about the entire semester. Those at the top have better access to resources, they have a better lifestyle, they have more access to resources, so they have better health care. Everything is better when you're at the top of the ladder than when you're at the bottom. In terms of the stratification system that rank countries within the world, those countries that are in dominated positions and thus poorer, as defined in the terms of political economic order, generally have higher rates of mortality and morbidity within their population as a whole than those who are in dominant positions. So it's not just on the individual level where the people in the dominant positions are better off than those who are dominated. When you look at the actual country as a whole, the countries themselves who are in the dominant position tend to do better than those countries who are dominated by another. Much of these differences in patterns are accounted for by differences in availability of survival needs. So this is a healthy diet. This is adequate shelter, clean water, clean air, and differences in access to medical services when they're needed. The Human Development Index, the HDI, was developed by the United Nations Development Program that evaluates the development of countries in terms of human development. I know it's a lot of developments. It's a summary measure of average achievement in key dimensions of human development. And that includes a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, and having a decent standard of living. The HDI is a more comprehensive measure of structural violence, since it not only considers differences in life expectancy, but includes other measures regarding the loss of human potential because of the systems of structured inequality, both within the world and then within the said societies. So it's not just, how long are you going to live, but are you going to have a healthy life? Are you going to have a decent standard of living? It doesn't matter how long you're living if the entire time you're alive, you're living in poverty, you're living in starvation conditions, you're riddled with illness. These are all things that are also taken into consideration in the HDI. So why is this a measure of structural violence? So if we can agree to the fact that violence is any action or inaction or a structural arrangement that results in physical or non-physical harm to one or more people, and that harm is fundamentally a condition that limits the development of human life potential, then the difference in development of humans within and across societies around the world, and then that measurement provides a measure of structural violence. Which I think, based on all the stuff that we've covered this semester, I think we can all agree on that violence is an action that harms or limits human life potential. Inaction, which would be negligence, not helping, allowing people to starve, not giving them access to resources, that is a condition that limits human life potential. And then having an arrangement in which people are fundamentally denied access to those things required for human life potential, those are all things that we would consider violence. So then if we just look at, okay, well, how is this potential for human life being infringed upon? That gives us a measurement of structural violence. So ultimately, the differences in the levels of human development are a result of the differences in their position that we act within and in response to conditions created by those. The most recent index is composed of several indicators, such as health, education, income. A score of 1 indicates a country that is highest on all measures. A score lower than 1 indicates the country is lower on one or more of those indicators compared to the country that has the highest. It's important to realize that since we are principally focusing on averages within a given country, such as life expectancy, income, education, the measure is not sensitive to inequality within the country. It's just looking at the average of the country. If we want to look at the averages within the society, that would be something different. There's tables in your book in Chapter 9 on the HDI Feel free to look at it, familiarize yourself with it. I'm not going to ask specific questions on the exam, but I do want you to be familiar with what it looks like. So looking at the differences within countries, the inequality adjusted HDI, or IHDI, adjusts the HDI for inequality in the distribution of those said dimensions within the population. So that addresses the differences that we just talked about in the previous slide. When the IHDI equals the HDI, there's no inequality at all. That's probably next to impossible. As we've seen, all societies have some sort of inequality base as far as stratification, but that would be perfect. If the IHDI equals the HDI, there would be no inequality at all. They would be perfectly equal. However, the IHDI falls further below the HDI as inequality rises. So the bigger the difference, the larger the inequality within the society. So the IHDI is the actual level of human development in regards to inequality, while the HDI can be viewed as what the potential of human development would be if there was no inequality. And again, you see those numbers, you look at the differences. So if you look at a comparison of the two sets of averages for each of the two sets of countries, the highest and the lowest, the development index drops from 0.9 to 0.8, and 0.3 to 0.2, which is a 9% and 36% drop for the lowest developed countries. And that's 4 times greater of a drop in the index. So what does all of this mean? This is a lot of numbers. Again, I don't expect you to know the numbers, as long as you have the general understanding and the gist of what they're saying, the difference between the HDI and the IHDI. In the poorest countries, you have the greatest disparity in those components of measures, which indicates a greater disparity in human development than what is found in the most advanced countries. So this is comparing lowest to highest. The Human Development Report presented trends in the IHDI since 1990 for 66 countries. The report notes worsening income inequality occurring in most countries and regions in the world. This would be a really great resource if you are looking at doing a case study on structural violence. I would highly recommend looking at the Human Development Report, the IHDI, and the HDI for the areas that you're looking at. So the effect of gender inequality, the GII, this is an index which measures the disadvantages associated with gender, such as reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market. It again has 0 and 1 scores. You're welcome to read through the rest of this. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail. It's set up very similar to the HDI and the IHDI as far as looking at how gender affects the levels of inequality. Natural disasters and structural violence. The way that people react to natural disasters and man-made disasters, for that matter. If we look at the story of the Titanic, historically, and how, we're not talking about the movie, when we look at the number of people that died, who was rescued, the people that were the wealthiest were closer to deck. They had easier access to the lifeboats. The people with the lower incomes, the workers on the ship, they were positioned very deep within the boat or the ship. Therefore, they had to go the farthest to get access to those resources to be saved. So if we look at survival, the people that were most likely to survive the accident were people who had the most means financially. If we look back at Hurricane Katrina, this was back in 2005. There were 50 different levee breaches in and around New Orleans. 80% of the water submerged, or 80% of the city was submerged. People were on their roofs, stranded for days on end. More than 900 people died in the aftermath. The victims were for the most part, they were poor, elderly, ill, or disabled. The largest portion of victims died by drowning, as some areas of the city were covered with 15 feet of water. Another 25% died of trauma and injury, and 11% from heart conditions. They were also disproportionately black. According to one researcher, 80% of New Orleans minority households lived in the flooded area, while only 54% of the white population did. This is an example of how, if you remember, we talked about before, property values in relation to undesirable areas, areas that flood easily, areas that are related to manufacturing. These are areas that tend to have higher rates of pollution. The property is not valued as high, therefore it attracts more lower income people and thus more minority populations. The average household income of those in the flooded area was $17,000 lower than those who lived in higher ground. So this shows the difference in income and where these people were living at. It was the concentrated poverty that rendered these poor people much more vulnerable to the effects of the hurricane. And I don't know how many of you were watching the news at the time or aware of these things at the time. There was also, and I don't have a slide for this, there was also a difference in how the hurricane was reported on the news. The news media often, if the people were white and they were going through homes and going through, abandoned businesses and trying to find supplies to survive, they were scavenging for resources. If the people doing the exact same thing were black, they were called looters. So there was also that difference in how the country was fed information regarding the effects of what happened of Hurricane Katrina. So that's all I have for how we measure structural violence. I know that was a lot of information, and it was a lot of really small little tidbits and numbers and statistics. Again, I don't expect you to know the details. I do expect you to know the basic of how these numbers are generated and what they mean. So please make sure that you are keeping that in mind.